I still remember the sound of her heels that morning. Sharp, rhythmic, and almost theatrical, echoing through the glass hallway like a countdown. I'd spent 11 years in that building, watched it rise from a rented floor to a skyline landmark, and somehow, I didn't realize I was walking toward my execution. She called me into the boardroom with a smile so polished it could have been rehearsed. The air smelled faintly of coffee and ambition, both things I had lived on for over a decade. When I sat down, she slid a folder across the table without meeting my eyes. "We've decided to restructure," she said, her tone smooth, corporate, merciless. "Your role is being dissolved. That word hung there like acid. I'd spent years dissolving my sleep, my weekends, my health into this company. I built departments, trained executives, created policies, including the very bylaws that gave her power to fire me. I waited for her to blink, to flinch, to show an ounce of guilt. She didn't. Instead, she leaned back, crossed her arms, and smirked. "You've done good work, truly, but we're moving in a new direction. A new direction. That's what they always say when they throw away the old guard." I wanted to speak, to ask why now. But the words caught in my throat. Maybe it was because I could already see the decision was final. Maybe it was because the HR rep sitting beside her looked at me like I was a corpse that hadn't realized it yet. As I stood to leave, my badge felt heavier than ever. 11 years, hundreds of late nights, countless saved deals, and now just silence. When I got home, I sat on my living room floor surrounded by old files and contracts, proof of a life's work. I opened one of the dusty binders I'd written years ago, the corporate governance manual. My handwriting was still in the margins, and that's when I saw it, a clause I had drafted under her direction long ago, one she'd never read carefully. It was a small thing, buried deep in Section 14.3, about executive accountability and misuse of restructuring power. I had written it to protect the company's employees from arbitrary dismissal, back when I still believed in fairness. That night, something inside me shifted. The shock began to fade, replaced by a quiet, cold focus. She thought firing me ended my chapter. What she didn't know was she had just opened a clause that could bury her career. I picked up my old fountain pen, the same one I used to sign her first promotion letter, and underlined those words slowly. Misuse of restructuring authority. My pulse steadied. For the first time in days, I smiled. I didn't plan on revenge that night. I planned on justice, written, signed, and sealed. By her own bylaws. For 11 years, my world revolved around that company. I joined when it was nothing more than a dream scribbled on whiteboards and coffee napkins. Back then, the office was small, cracked walls, mismatched chairs, and a handful of people who believed we could build something that mattered. I wasn't the loudest in the room, but I was the one who stayed late, who read every line of every document twice, who remembered the numbers no one else cared about. The CEO back then, before her, used to call me the backbone. And for years, that's exactly what I was. When she arrived, things changed. At first, I admired her. Confident, charismatic. She spoke like every word was a promise and every promise a vision. She took control of meetings with surgical precision, and I learned from her. How to negotiate, how to present, how to survive corporate storms. But as the company grew, so did her hunger. She wasn't building anymore. She was conquering. I began to notice the shift. How she'd cut people off mid-sentence, how she'd rewrite credit on reports, how loyalty slowly turned into leverage. Still, I stayed. Maybe out of loyalty, maybe out of fear of starting over after so many years of climbing. I remember the day she made me head of corporate operations. I thought it was recognition. In truth, it was convenience. I became the one who knew where everything was: contracts, financials, compliance manuals, audit trails. I was her silent safety net, the one who made sure every shortcut she took still looked legal. But power changes people. And she wanted it absolute. The last year before she fired me, she began to rewrite the bylaws, the ones I had originally helped draft when the company was still small. She said it was to modernize governance, but I knew what she was really doing. Consolidating control, silencing checks and balances, turning the board into her personal audience. She made every employee sign NDAs that leaned in her favor. She replaced longtime directors with loyal faces, and every time I raised a concern, she'd smile and say, "You worry too much. That's why you'll never lead." Maybe she was right. I never wanted to lead through fear. I led through structure, rules, ethics, systems. The very things she laughed at. But here's the irony. When she asked me to help fine-tune those new bylaws, I did. I reviewed every clause, line by line, like a loyal soldier. Only I didn't just correct her grammar or formatting. I quietly kept my own protections in place. Tiny clauses no one noticed, written in language so formal it slipped through every review. Clauses that, if ever activated, could trigger a full independent audit of the executive team. At the time, it was habit. The instinct of someone who believed rules were sacred. I never thought I'd need them. But now, sitting at my kitchen table with that same binder open before me, I realized fate had circled back. She thought she had rewritten the company in her image. What she didn't know was that the foundation still had my handwriting buried inside it. And soon, those words, cold, calculated, and forgotten, would become the very weapon that would bring her empire down. The first few days after the firing were a blur. Shock wrapped in silence. My phone stayed quiet. No calls from colleagues, no messages from the board. It was as if I had been erased overnight. 11 years, and not one person dared to ask what happened. Fear travels fast in corporate hallways. But grief has a strange way of transforming when you give it purpose. By the 5th morning, I wasn't crying anymore. I was reading. Line after line of the bylaws, the employee handbook, the board governance code, everything I had once written with pride. And there, hidden in plain sight, were my old fingerprints. Clause 14.3. Any executive restructuring found to be enacted under personal bias, conflict of interest, or self-benefit shall trigger a mandatory internal audit. Clause 9.7. If any board member benefits financially from a terminated employee's project or division within 90 days of dismissal, the transaction shall be frozen pending review. I had written those words years ago, back when I still believed in fairness, not realizing they would someday serve as my armor. Out of habit, I opened my work email one last time. To my surprise, it was still active. She must have forgotten to revoke my access immediately. A mistake. A small one, but in my hands, a spark. I combed through old threads, budgets, and internal memos. It didn't take long before I found something odd. A restructuring report dated 2 weeks before my firing, showing the transfer of my department's accounts to a shell entity under her name's initials. My pulse quickened. She hadn't fired me for performance. She'd fired me to clear a path, to absorb my division's contracts before the board's next fiscal review. For days, I collected data quietly. Downloaded logs, cross-referenced emails, took screenshots. Every document told a small story. Together, they painted her portrait. A leader who had rewritten the company's laws to protect herself, but had forgotten the one person who wrote them better than she ever could. Still, part of me hesitated. I wasn't built for destruction. I believed in rules, in process, in quiet justice. But then, one afternoon, I received an email, a generic HR message addressed to all employees. We thank my name for her years of service and wish her the best in her future endeavors. A public erasure. No mention of my work, my contributions, my decade of loyalty. Just a bland farewell, like I'd been a temporary contractor. And beneath that, her signature. Best. CEO. That's when the hesitation died. I reached out to an old friend, the company's former compliance officer, a man who had quietly resigned 6 months earlier when he saw too much. We met at a cafe near the harbor, far from the glass towers. He listened as I laid out the evidence, his face turning pale with every file I showed him. When I finished, he leaned back and whispered, "If what you're showing me is true, this isn't just unethical, it's illegal." He gave me the contact of an external auditor who occasionally worked with the board. "They can't ignore this if it's filed correctly," he said. "Just be smart. They'll come for you if they sense it's personal." But it wasn't personal anymore. It was structural. She'd corrupted the system I helped build, and I intended to fix it, with precision. That night, I wrote a formal report addressed to the board of directors, anonymous. Structured and supported by every clause she had ignored, I attached documentation, transaction trails, and timelines, citing the exact bylaws that demanded an internal audit. Before sending it, I stared at her name one last time in the CC field. I didn't include it. Not yet. When I finally hit send, I didn't feel vengeful. I felt restored, like I had finally stepped back into the framework I built, one where rules meant something again. The next morning, the email was already circulating quietly among the directors. And within hours, the first tremor hit the company. Meetings were canceled. The finance department was locked for review. The board called for an emergency session. And her once perfect confidence began to crack. It started with whispers, the kind that travel through polished corridors faster than official memos. Something was wrong. That much was clear. But no one dared to say what. My former colleagues began messaging me privately, cautiously, as if touching a live wire. "There's an internal review happening," one wrote. "They've frozen executive expense accounts." Another said, "She's furious. Someone reported her to the board." I smiled without replying. Let her wonder who lit the match. 2 days later, I received an email from her personal assistant. Not a professional message, but a venomous one. "You think you can undermine leadership from outside? Be careful what you start." For a moment, the old fear flickered back, the same fear she used to control people with. But then I remembered I was outside her chain of command now. Her power ended where my signature had once begun. By the third day, the board's audit committee issued an official announcement. A routine review of executive restructuring decisions over the past fiscal quarter. That was their polite way of saying, "We're investigating the boss." I knew the system well. I had built its scaffolding. Once an audit began, everything had to be disclosed. Communications, transaction histories, conflict of interest forms. There was no hiding once the process started, but she wasn't going down quietly. That evening, my phone rang. Her number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Her voice came sharp, cold, and deliberate. "I know it was you," she said. "Only you would know where to look. You think this makes you noble? You've made an enemy of the wrong person." I stayed silent, letting her words echo through the line. Then she added, almost laughing, "You really think you can take me down with paperwork?" When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "Not paperwork," I said softly. "Policy. The ones you never read." She hung up. The next day, she called an all-hands meeting. I wasn't there, of course, but recordings made their way to me. She stood in front of the company and delivered a speech dripping with control. She claimed the audit was a targeted attack, that disloyal individuals were trying to damage the firm's reputation. She even announced a legal motion against unauthorized data access, implying I had stolen company information, was the final act of betrayal, not just against me, but against the truth. She was willing to drag my name through the mud to save herself. That night, I met again with the former compliance officer. He had received confirmation from a board contact. They found irregularities, unapproved transfers, unreported personal benefits, and worse, manipulated records disguised as department reallocations. "She's trapped," he told me. "The board will have no choice but to suspend her." But something in me didn't celebrate yet. I knew her. She wouldn't accept defeat unless she could twist it into martyrdom. 2 days later, it happened. She leaked an internal memo claiming she was stepping down temporarily due to health reasons, a move designed to make her look dignified, voluntary, even noble. The media picked it up. She gave interviews about the challenges of modern leadership, painting herself as a victim of internal politics. For a brief moment, it worked. Public sympathy started shifting toward her. She was rewriting the narrative, just like she always did. That night, I sat alone staring at the television as her face filled the screen. Calm, composed, untouchable. And I realized this wasn't over. I hadn't come this far just to watch her escape through a polished lie. If she wanted to play reputation chess, then I'd make the next move, the one she'd never see coming. Because while she was busy defending herself in public, she didn't know the audit report was about to reach the shareholders' inboxes. And buried in that report was a single paragraph, one she'd never be able to explain away. A paragraph written by me, years ago, tucked quietly into the bylaws. In cases of proven executive misconduct or conflict of interest, all severance rights, share privileges, and leadership positions shall be permanently revoked pending board review. She thought she had destroyed me with a single meeting, but in truth she had only activated her own downfall, line by line, clause by clause, betrayal by betrayal. When the board called for an emergency meeting, I didn't panic. I planned. For days I had been assembling pieces, threads of truth woven into a map they could not ignore. The audit had opened a door. The plan was how to walk through it without stumbling. First rule: make it procedural, not personal. I refused to let emotion show in the files. Anger is noisy. Procedure is surgical. So I organized everything the way the board and regulators would expect. Timeline, evidence chain, witness statements, and a cold legal narrative tying transactions to conflict of interest clauses. I labeled every document, time-stamped every screenshot, and cross-referenced emails with contract numbers. No drama, just facts. Facts that would breathe under scrutiny. Second rule: build alliances quietly. I reached out to 3 people I trusted implicitly: the former compliance officer, an ex-board member who still respected governance, and the independent auditor my friend had recommended. None of them wanted a spectacle. They wanted the company to survive intact. Once they reviewed the materials, they agreed to back an independent third-party forensic audit and to insist the board follow the exact procedures mandated in the bylaws. That was the clever part. The bylaws required action, and the bylaws themselves were my script. Third rule: control the narrative without broadcasting it. She loved the headlines. I refused to give her that power. Instead, I prepared a shareholder briefing. Clinical, anonymized, and focused on fiduciary risk. I knew that if shareholders were informed of potential financial exposure and legal risk, they would demand immediate remediation. Directors are quick to act when their liability is on the line. Fourth rule: hit where it hurts: governance and finances. The documents I'd uncovered showed transfers to a shell entity, unexplained personal reimbursements, and a pattern of accelerated contract assignments timed suspiciously around her executive moves. The bylaws I'd drafted years ago contained language that froze transactions tied to terminated employees and mandated full disclosure of board member benefits. I used that language like a lock. Once the forensic audit validated the irregularities, the board would be forced to freeze the suspect accounts and suspend her authority. And not just for optics. For the first time, she'd have no unilateral control. Fifth rule: keep my hands clean. I didn't want to be subpoenaed or painted as a saboteur, so I filed everything through the proper channels. An anonymous but traceable report to the audit committee, a redacted packet to the shareholders, and direct verified communication with the external auditor. I let process do the heavy lifting. The bylaws required certain steps be taken when an executive is implicated. By insisting those steps be followed to the letter, I transformed a personal betrayal into an institutional correction. There were contingencies. If she tried to gaslight the board further, I had a second dossier: voice notes, meeting minutes, and a ledger of approvals she had signed. If she attempted a legal counterattack, the independent auditor would testify to the chain of custody and the immutability of the data. I also secured a sympathetic director who could call an emergency shareholder meeting if the board dragged its feet. Every escape route she might use had a corresponding trapdoor I had prepared. But perhaps the most elegant piece of the plan was subtle: leverage her own ego. She had always performed power as theater. She loved to hold the microphone. I arranged for the audit committee to present findings at a closed session with legal counsel present. That way, when the evidence landed on the table, there was no grandstanding, only corporate law and consequence. Her narrative of victimhood would collapse under the weight of sworn documents and clause citations. I won't pretend it didn't feel ruthless. It did. Not because I wanted harm, but because I wanted accountability. A reset where rules mattered more than personalities. I thought about the late nights, the contracts I saved, the interns I mentored. I thought about the 1,000 small courtesies she'd returned with cruelty. All of that crystallized into one objective: ensure the company didn't belong to someone who could bend its laws for personal gain. On the eve of the board presentation, I sat with my binder one last time. I flipped to the page where my older handwriting curled into formal clauses, the quiet language that had once been dismissed as bureaucratic fluff. I traced a finger along the printed words and whispered, not to celebrate, but to remind myself why I'd stayed. Structure matters. Principles matter. When the audit committee opened the floor the next morning, I was nowhere in the room. But every paper they read, every freeze they enacted, and every question they asked carried my hand. The bylaws I wrote had become the scalpel. The board was about to use it, and at the center of it all was her. Brilliant at spectacle, disastrously unprepared for procedure. She had rewritten the rules to suit herself, but she had forgotten one truth. Rules mean something only when someone insists they do. I had insisted. The next part would be the reckoning. The board meeting that morning began like every other, polished, tense, formal. But beneath the mahogany table and the corporate etiquette, a quiet storm waited to break. I wasn't there in person, but one of my allies was. The independent auditor I'd briefed privately. His voice was calm as he began presenting the findings. We have identified multiple breaches of the company's governance policy, including Section 9.7 and 14.3 of the bylaws. Those were my clauses, my invisible fingerprints. He placed copies of the audit report before each director. As the pages turned, the air changed. The directors, once her silent supporters, began to frown. Each line exposed something new: unauthorized fund transfers, personal expense claims disguised as strategic research, client accounts redirected to entities she controlled off-record. And then came the bombshell. The audit traced one of those shell entities directly back to her private consultancy, a firm registered under her maiden name. A clear conflict of interest, the kind of thing that destroys entire careers. Someone recorded that meeting. Later, I watched it quietly at home. She sat at the head of the table, perfectly composed at first. That same calm confidence she always wore. But as the evidence stacked higher, her smile thinned. She tried to interrupt, claiming it was a misunderstanding, that delegation errors had caused the discrepancies. But the auditor didn't waver. These documents bear your signature, he said softly. Her jaw clenched. You could almost hear the mask crack. One of the board members, an older man who had always admired her, leaned forward and said, You signed off on these reallocations days before restructuring key staff, including the termination of the department that managed these accounts. There was silence, then a single heavy sentence from the chairwoman. Effective immediately, all of your executive privileges are suspended pending a full investigation. In that moment, the mighty CEO, the woman who believed herself untouchable, sat frozen, stripped of the authority she'd built her empire upon. No cameras, no applause, just the soft click of her pen as she set it down. By evening, word had leaked to the financial press. CEO steps down amid audit probe. The story spread like fire through investor circles. For the first time, she wasn't controlling the narrative. Her image of composure shattered under headlines she couldn't edit. I thought I'd feel triumphant. I didn't. Watching her downfall wasn't satisfying. It was surreal. The woman who once towered over me was now cornered by her own arrogance, trapped in the system she had underestimated. 2 days later, she called me again. This time, her voice was different, brittle, weary. You wanted revenge, she said. Well, you got it, I paused. No, I said quietly. I wanted accountability. You just made it personal when you fired me. She laughed bitterly. You think the board cares about fairness? They'll replace me, and they'll forget you too. Maybe, I said, but they'll remember what's written. Because that was the point. Not to win, but to make the framework stronger than the people who abuse it. Later that week, the board announced permanent leadership changes. She wasn't included in the new structure. Her severance, revoked, thanks to the very clause she once approved. Her shares, frozen pending litigation. Her name, erased from the company's leadership page. I walked past the building one last time that Friday evening. The same glass walls, the same polished floors, but everything felt different. The company I had once built my life around now had a chance to be clean again, structured, accountable, free from her shadow. And somewhere deep down, I felt peace. Not the loud, cinematic kind, the quiet kind that comes when justice is done in silence. But her story wasn't quite over yet. Because when you strip power from someone who's addicted to it, they don't vanish, they fight. And I could already sense her next move forming behind closed doors. Only this time, I was ready. In the weeks that followed, the company entered a strange calm. The kind that only comes after a storm has taken everything loud with it. For the first time in years, the hallways I once knew weren't ruled by fear. The new interim leadership began restoring the departments she had gutted, rehiring talent, reinstating the old code of ethics I had written years ago. It felt poetic. The rules she once mocked were now being used to rebuild what she broke. I stayed quiet, watching from the sidelines. My name was never mentioned in the press releases or board memos, and that was fine. I didn't need recognition. I needed closure. Then, one evening, I received a short email from the new chairwoman. Your documentation was invaluable in identifying procedural breaches. Thank you for your integrity and for believing in the system. We hope to consult you on governance restoration. I sat for a long moment, reading that line again. Believing in the system. That's what this had always been about. I never wanted to destroy. I wanted to remind people that even in corporate jungles, rules still matter. As the audit findings became public, she tried one last move. A lawsuit claiming defamation and emotional distress. But her own signed approvals were admissible, and within days, her case was dismissed. The irony was almost cinematic. She had built her power on documents, and now, documents had undone her. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I reopened the old binder that had started it all, the original bylaws. I flipped to the final section, the one I'd drafted in my early years, when I still believed leadership meant stewardship. The clause read, "Authority without accountability corrupts all." I smiled faintly. Back then, it was just a principle I'd borrowed from an old mentor. Now it felt like a prophecy fulfilled. Sometimes revenge doesn't arrive in the form of fury or spectacle. It arrives in the quiet turning of a page, the signature on an audit, the simple restoration of truth. Weeks later, I was invited to return as an independent consultant to help restructure the very compliance framework that had once protected her. I accepted, not for money, not even for pride, but because rebuilding something broken felt like closure. On my first day back, I walked past her old office. The nameplate was gone, replaced by a blank silver strip waiting for someone new. The blinds were half open, sunlight spilling across the desk, clean, empty, waiting. I stood there for a moment and whispered, "Full circle." As I walked away, I realized the real victory wasn't in her downfall. It was in reclaiming my voice after years of silence. I didn't need to shout or gloat. The system had spoken for me, and for the first time in 11 years, I wasn't working for power. I was working for peace. When the dust settled, I realized something profound. Revenge wasn't the victory I thought it would be. It wasn't the applause from the boardroom or the hush that followed her resignation. It was the quiet dignity of knowing I never lowered myself to her level. I simply used the truth, and her own arrogance, to undo the empire she built on manipulation. Years of loyalty had taught me one brutal lesson. In corporate life, contracts and kindness rarely coexist. You can give your all, but if the foundation is built on fear and ego, it's destined to crack. I didn't win because I destroyed her. I won because I walked away clean, with my principles intact and my head high. And sometimes, that's the sweetest revenge of all, turning the page while they're still stuck rereading their downfall. This is Revenge Untold, where silence becomes power, and justice finds its own voice. Don't forget to subscribe. The next secret is already unfolding.